I know how the sister feels. That applause should come like all the way up here. Just because it gives you a little more energy and less nervousness. So, first things first. I gotta have my own tweet. Y'all look good. Y'all looking real good. And y'all looking good. Thank you for that moment. I'll type in a moment. Woo. So I believe that today, tomorrow, and every day that we are in this struggle continuing is about the power of our stories. And so I want to talk about that a little bit. Alverna Denise Kahn, Debbie Thomas, Rhonda DeVore, Janice Giroux, Novella Dudley, Gugu Dlamini, Pandora Singleton, Annette Subira Dufault, Mama Folion, Cicely Bolden, Phyllis Sharp, and Iris de la Cruz. These are just a few of the names that I consistently run through my mind almost every single day, because in addition to all those other names, Sojourner Truth and Harriet Tubman and Frederick Douglass and my grandma Georgia and my grandpa Grady, that these too are my new ancestors. And they remind me and they guide me and they bind me to this struggle, to this work, to this justice that we all deserve. Whether they lived with HIV in their bodies or in their lives, they died in the struggle against it and all of the intersecting oppressions that allow it to thrive. So in my own story, 30 years ago, I think I was the youngest thing that became a member of the Black Women's Health Project because I was an 18-year-old student at Spelman College the summer those bold, bodacious, beautiful Black women graced my campus. 30 years ago, I took leave from a scholarship based on racism at a Black women's college and ended up working in the feminist movement at the Federation of Feminist Women's Health Centers, the Feminist Women's Health Center in Atlanta. And because of, I'll say it, some class and race and age issues, even in my feminist environment, I also started Sister Love Incorporated 25 years ago this year. Now, there's another couple of 20th anniversaries I want us to lift up. This year is the 20th anniversary of the genocide in Rwanda that claimed, as we should remember, about 400,000 women and girls' lives. That 20 years ago, we saw the advent of a new South Africa, where 20 years later, we are seeing the ongoing claiming of women and girls' lives. And 20 years ago, the AIDS epidemic actually began for women. It was the first time that our federal government decided to include women, poor people, homeless people, and some children in the overall AIDS case definition. So we've still got a long way to go because we're still fighting for that inclusion today, especially when we become more radically identified as women and include the cause and the case of transgendered people in the HIV epidemic. So back then, it was not a friendly place to do HIV and AIDS work and reproductive health and rights. It wasn't. And back then, it was not a friendly place to do reproductive health and rights and HIV and AIDS. But what I knew for sure was that especially women, but people who were at risk or affected by HIV, had needs and issues and rights concerns about sexual health education and our resources, about trauma and violence, about our reproduction, about our sexual expression and pleasure, about criminalization and disclosure, about the right to protect ourselves and whom we love. So, for example, when we look at the new science of microbicides or biomedical prevention options. The reason we had to bring that fight to the floor was because women engaged or suffering in relationships with abuse and violence or gender imbalances or sexual inequities could not negotiate a dadgum condom, could not talk about what their own sexual needs, and still cannot talk about how they would like to express themselves. For women living with HIV, pregnancy was an option non-plus. It was a zero-sum game. You get an abortion, you're gonna die anyway. Or if we snatch your parental rights for another cause, you're gonna die. Why do we give you your children back in the first place? And if I want to get pregnant, why would we assist you in doing something as heinous and irresponsible and selfish as that? If I want to be a sexual being as an HIV positive person, I'm not allowed, I am judged, I am shamed. And if I am transgender and living with HIV, then my economic justice predetermines my health outcomes. So, in addition to needing safe and dignifying work options, including decriminalized and legal sex work, my ability to earn my own income and get my own coverage for health care is already diminished. So, HIV and AIDS, for all people, particularly women and girls, is an issue of reproductive justice. I am happy to be home, thank you very much. Because of reproductive justice, I found a home. I found a home framework for the work that we do in HIV and AIDS, and that we have always done from day one. Because let me just be real. Sitting in a workshop early on, just trying to learn out what this AIDS thing meant for us girls, we actually had a workshop led by the number one madam in all of Atlanta, who actually worked for City Hall and ran the largest, most successful sex work ring in Atlanta for years, who then came and taught us how to do cheeking, how to do all kinds of things. And it was immediate for me to make this cheeking, condoms in your mouth, put them on. So, yes, we can teach that still, along with self-cervical exam. So, the first notion, because I'm a visual person, right? So the first notion I got was, het women, gay men, we fuck the same people. Men, right? So evidently there's not a large divide between us in this epidemic, and that was in the early 80s. And for us to be sitting here still trying to convince our own communities, our own populations, and people in the reproductive justice and reproductive rights movement that this is an issue for all of us, which means at some point we are all queer, then we have to get forward on that conversation about what connects us and not what divides us. So here's what I come to tell you about those stories. Positive people, positive women are your leaders in reproductive justice. And right now, 20 years later into the epidemic of women, we are now seeing the birth of the Positive Women's Network, USA. These super soul sonic, self-determined, and ass-kicking sisters are taking it across the nation as folks who are bold enough to disclose, who are able enough to discourse, and of course, who are ready enough to fight. And to fight not just for themselves, but for everyone. Now, in my last minute, I want to do two things. I want to remind you of the history and tell you about our present and our future. The way that whole case definition thing even happened 20 years ago was because of women like Iris De La Cruz and Phyllis, and by God, the most mighty reproductive justice lawyer I know in my life, Terry McGovern, who initiated and led the fight against the CDC, who sued the state of New York, who sued the Social Security Administration to ensure that women were included in the fight. And why was this important then, and why is this story important now? Because we all remember it as a story of ACT UP, AIDS Coalition to Unleash Power. But I want to remind you, as much as an ACT UP member I still am, that it was the women of color living with HIV who had to convince the boys and girls of ACT UP that AIDS was their issue too. And we led a campaign for 4 long, ridiculously brutal years where women died never getting a diagnosis, never knowing their names, where for 4 years our mantra was, women don't get AIDS, we just die from it. And we can still say that today simply because the Social Security Administration, the Centers for Disease Control, and many of our state governments, did they mention I'm from Georgia? And many of our state governments are regressing and turning back the clock on all of the advances we've made in reproductive justice, especially related to HIV. What I know about what these positive women can do is first they know the issues. They know the issues of prevention and treatment and care and stigma and discrimination and marginalization, sexual exploitation and objectification. They know the issues of gender-respectful services and reproductive justice and human rights. But what they also have is the hindsight, the foresight, the vision, the wisdom, the experience, the moral authority to decide, a collective voice to make some noise and lead some change. So I want to get back to acting up. And maybe we're not the AIDS coalition to unleash power, but we certainly are the allied coalition to unleash power. So what I would say to you, and I want you to say to me, is get your act up, back up. Get your act up, back up. Get your act up, back up. Act up, fight back, fight AIDS. Act up, fight back, fight AIDS. Act up, fight back, fight AIDS. Act up.